We'll do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chof Tes, volume 29. This is the second Sicha for the portion of Voeschanan, in which there is a whole discussion why explaining the halacha that the Rambam brings down from this week's Parsha, Voeschanan, in which the Torah talks about one who is in the Ori Miklot for killing somebody accidentally, so he goes to the city of refuge, that the teacher of that person who's been exiled is exiled as well to that city so he can continue teaching his student, the person who went to exile. So a Talmid Shagola Maglin Rabbi Ime will give the teacher will go into exile together with the students. And the Rambam adds explanation because we have to v'chai, you have to give him his life, and the Rambam writes that the life uh, of a Talmud who was involved in Torah, without it is worthless. But the Rebbe goes through and explains that even if he's not at the level, explains the Rambam that even if he's not at the level yet that he is so connected with the learning, because after all, he came to this level of killing somebody accidentally, but he is still mivak sheho. He seeks that. The Rebbe goes into the whole idea of a person who seeks to become will eventually become. The Rebbe brings down also in the service of Hashem and in the connection of Hashem, as the Rebbe will explain. This Sikha, it says here in the star, was also connected with Chof of the Yortzeit, because Shabbos Parshas Voeschanan did that year in Tavshim Hey got its blessing Chof of from the Parshas Voeschanan, so it's connected to Chof of the Yortzeit of the Rebbe's father, Harav Agon, Harav Chosid, Umekubel, one who's done tremendous activities for Torah mitzvahs and has brought many people back. That's Morein Levi Yitzchok Zal Schneerson, the Rebbe Levi Yitzchok, the father of the Rebbe. And he was exiled also. That's the connection to exile. He was exiled for his work in strengthening and spreading out Yiddishkeit. And then he actually passed away in the year Tafshin Daled while he was exiled in Alma Ata in Kazakhstan, and that's where he is interned, Shom Nuchasekovid. So this Sikha, which talks about, explains ideas of exile, is specifically also associated with the Chaf Av, which is the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's father, who passed away in exile. Sichos learned the Nishmas of Rabbi Yitzchok ben Rabbi Chaim Tzvi Tehei Nishmos Yitzrura B'Tzrei Rachayim. We'll go in the Sikha now, Seder, step by step. Aleph. From dem Posig B'Parsha Seinu, from the verse in our Parsha, V'nos el achas min ha'orim ha'el v'choi. So the person will run away, he will escape. The accidental murderer will escape to one of these cities that they have designated as cities of refuge. And the pasuk says, "V'choi," he will live. So from this "v'choi," that he will live, learned men up. The Gemara learns from this as Talmid Shagolo Maglin Rabbi Imei, a student who is uh, in exile, who went into exile. We will exile Rabbi Imai, the teacher of that student will go into exile with him. Shenemar, we learned this out from the Pasuk. It says, V'chai, Ovid lei midit havilecha yusa. You have to do for him something which would give him chayas, that would give him life. The Rambam, Besifre Hayad, the Rambam in the Sefer Hayad, bringt up dem din. He brings this din, but he adds explanation. He says, Talmid shagolo l'orei michlot, a student who exiled to the cities of refuge. Maglin Rabbi Yimei, we exiled his teacher with him. Shenemar, because the Pasuk says the Rambam, v'cherai, that he should live. Asay loy kidei sheyichya. Do for him so that he can live. Und is dabei meisik. But the Rambam adds over here explanation. And the Rambam says, V'chaye b'alei chochmo mevaksheho b'lei talmud Torah, so that the life of those who seek Torah and those who are masters of wisdom and seek wisdom, b'lei talmud, if without learning Torah, k'misach hashuvim, is equal, is considered like death. So since the Pasuk says V'chai, you have to make sure that he's alive. Without Torah, to these people who are Bali Torah, Bali Chochem Baksho, life isn't life. It's considered like Misa, and the Torah says V'chai. So therefore, we have to continue. We have to exile also the Rav over there into exile. So what was the Rambam explaining over here? So basically, the Rebbe explains now that the Rambam's addition gives the reason why we should do this to the Rav. Why should we exile the Rav? And basically, what we're trying to say, there is no choice, because without it, the student would be dead, and the Torah says V'chai. So was is the Rambam eisen mit der Heisofer? What does the Rambam want by adding this addition that the life of the Balei Chochmah Vakshaho is considered like death? Kemen Zogan, so we can say, as the mid bavorun terashai lepshuta in dem din, that he's cautioning and answering a very simple question about this halacha. Af al pi as men darf zustellen dem heutig nefesh bishgogo. Okay, so notwithstanding that we must provide for the person who killed accidentally, we need to provide everything that he needs. In the city of refuge, the halacha is we have to provide him whatever he needs. And that's why, so that's understood. And as the Gemara says, you can't just send him away in a place where he doesn't have the necessities of life, the needs. In Meshivin Oison, that you cannot settle down these cities of refuge, Elabim Koimayim, there needs to be a place where there is water. Bimkoim Shvokim, there's a place where there's Markes Chulu, meaning that the life of this accidental murderers should not be impacted as not to have the needs, and you send them make these cities of refuge in places where everything is available. There's water, there's marketplace, etc. So that much we know. But yet, we would not expect that we have to send the teacher there. Is aber nit muvan. Bosfaran ort hotes, what logic is there? As menzolas tonne for cheshbon von a zweiten, that to do this on the account of another yid, he needs to be provided. So we're taking another yid, his Rav, and we're bringing him to exile. Especially if it's his teacher. So Shikun Rabbi in Golus, we're sending this teacher into exile. Kidel learn the Torah with them Talmud so that he can learn Torah with his students. So we're sending him there too. So while we understand that we should provide for the one in exile what he needs, but how could we do this on the account of the teacher? He needs to learn. Why take the teacher though? I mean, that seems to be not reasonable. So therefore, the Rambam is going to answer that it's a matter of life or death. So we have to do that. But especially the Rebbe says, uh, we're not talking here about an innocent uh, person, a total innocent person. Yeah, it was an accident that he killed somebody, but even to kill somebody by accident must mean that he has a certain level uh, of uh, improper to kill. That's why he needs to go to exile. He needs atonement. And here we're taking a Rav and bringing him into exile when the person his student did was not proper. Befrat, especially as Noretzich wegen a Talmud, was is begangen in dem Chet von Heurig Nefesh. We're talking about a student who committed the sin of killing somebody. Take bishgogo. So let it be it was by accident. Aber das Gufe weist, but that alone points to the fact, as it is Shaleki the boy, that he's not the way one should be. Was the Faris El Chayiv Golus. That's why he has to go in exile, because he did do something wrong. He's not proper. So that should be an atonement. So we have to say that he's not a good, proper student. Eiberwald given a Talmud Hogan Kideboy, if he was a proper, fitting uh, student, but Azak Takola Gedoyla Nidgikum Liyode. So such a uh, big stumbling to kill somebody accidentally wouldn't come to him. Uh, so the fact that he needs kapora and the fact that he's did such a thing, let it be by mistake, means that it wasn't proper. He wasn't 100% a good student because well, had he been a real good student, such a great stumbling would not have happened to him. With the Gemara zogt, if I heard nefesh bishgoga, the Gemara says when somebody kills somebody accidentally, merishoyim yetzeresha, that from evil comes evil. The fact that evil came from him makes him he's a rasha. So he's not Hogan. So here we're saying that such a student who is not a Hogun, who's not proper, and he ended up killing somebody accidentally. So now we're going to make an Adam Hogun, a proper person, the person in the form of the Rav, going to send him to exile so that this student will have what he needs, will have the Torah that he needs. Is the Rambam the Farmaisiv? So that's why the Rambam adds, the life of the masters of wisdom and those who seek it, if they don't have Torah, is kimiso chashuvim. This is considered, it's not just stam, a need, a necessity, but this is, without it, it's like death. That inyan from Talmud Torah, the idea of learning Torah, which is chochma, ale chochma, by a Talmud is not nor vigor wichtige tzorchim shaloi. It's not equal to very important needs that he has. As Mizol Zogun, so then you would say, if it was in the category of important things, the Baal Dazer hat sich früher in Torah, since he previously occupied himself in Torah, is das geworden sein Esek, then that becomes his occupation. So because he was involved in it, and therefore we have to continue to give it to him. Ubemela darf man ihm geben die Gelegenheit, so he needs to have the opportunity to können weiter mamshach sein Limud Torah, to be able to continue further in the study of Torah. If that was the extent of it, then we taka don't have a good reason. Why should we send another person for this person to allow him to continue what he was doing? That's why the Rambam explains that not learning Torah is not just to continue his occupation. No, Nachmer, but more than that, das is a shaila fun chayim un hepech chayim. This question here is about life itself and opposite of life. Kimisa chashuvim, that this is considered like death. So this is is not a question of just continue the occupation. So, Mibal Torah zokt az v'chai. Since the Torah tells us that he has to live, is nitokim breira. So there is really no choice. Umemuz shikun rabbi in Golus, and we must send his teacher into exile, so he can be alive. So the Rambam explains that the need for learning Torah for this student is at the level that it's like saving his life, and therefore it explains why we would make another person go, the Rav, go to the exile, because that's saving his life. Where do we know that it's considered for? Where do we see that it's considered saving a life? And the mocker of them, and the source of this, as that the life of masters of wisdom without Torah is considered like this. You can say this is actually a full pasuk, the pasuk in Koheles that says, the wisdom, in this case, the Torah, gives life to its masters, those who own the Chokhmah. So therefore, without the Chokhmah, without the Torah, they're not Bechayis. So this is the source of the Rambam, that it needs to give we need to provide for him, his teacher, so he can have his Chayis, he can have his life. So the Rebbe explains that the Rambam adds the words of explanation that the life of a Balei Chokhmah is not a life without Torah, to explain the rationale. Why would the Torah send the Rav in order to provide for the person who's in exile his needs? And the explanation is because that's a matter of life or death, as we learn the source from this pasuk. So this puts this student, according to the Rambam's explanation, that why would we send the Rav into exile? Seems like if we go by this explanation, is because the entire life of the student is dependent on this Rav coming there. But the reality is, the halacha is, even if a student is not yet at that madrega that his whole life is the learning, and still the halacha is that you're going to send the Rav to him, if the whole explanation is because he has no life without Torah, and therefore that justifies sending the Rav to him. But what about students who are not at that level? Their life is not fully Torah. The halacha doesn't distinguish between what kind of a student it is. All students get to have their Rav come to teach them. But if the whole explanation is that because that's his life, how could we say this about all students? We need to look into very well in these Rambam's words. What about the students who are not at that level? They need to look into very well in these Rambam's words. Leuten Bier Harambam darf heute auskommen. According to the explanation of the Rambam, it turns out, it should turn out, as der Din von Talmid Shagola Magel in the Rabbi Imay, that this halacha, a student who was exiled, we will also exile the teacher with him, is dafke by a Talmud, welcher is in der Darge. It would only be by a student who is at the level was sein ganzer Chaim is Talmud Torah, that his entire life is study of Torah. Bis to such an extent as below Talmud Torah Kemisa Chashuvim. Without learning Torah is considered death. That's the student that deserves to get the rabbi to teach him, because without it he has no life. And that's the explanation that the Rambam gives for this halacha. But that's not the psak. The psak din that every student gets to get their rav to come to them to teach them. Aber the halacha is doch stam. The halacha is in a general way. Talmid shegolo, a student that exile. The Gemara macht nit kein chiluk. The Gemara makes no distinction. Und is nit medagdig wegen welchen Talmid es redt sich. It's not particular about which kind of a student we are discussing that we will send the Rav there. The contrary, it seems from the Gemara's continuation that a person needs to be careful who he teaches, because here he ends up having a student in exile. He ends up in exile. So you see that this student, as we said before, is not a proper student. It may not be at the level of old master of Torah. That's the Rabbi. So on the contrary, in the Gemara itself, you see that we're not talking about a student who is really a proper student. Behemshech zum Din von Talmud Shegola Maglin Rabbi Imei, following up this halacha, that a student who was exiled, we exiled their teacher with him. Zog the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Mikan, what do we see from here? Shala Yeshana Odom L'Talmid She'ene Hogun. A person should not be teaching a student who is not a fitting student. Why? Because since he's not fitting, Shalo Yivi Uhu Ave Noisof Lidei Hariga B'Shegeg, so that the sins, because he is not a fitting student, so then the sins shall not bring him to accidentally Hariga B'Shegeg, killing somebody accidentally, V'yigla, and he'll end up being in Golus, and then the teacher will go with him. The Abrinan Lekamon, the Gemara later on in Makkos over there, that I've quoted before also, this is only common by the Shoyim to end up killing somebody accidentally. So that means, to begin with, the student that the Rav is teaching is an Einei Hogun, and that's why he ends up killing somebody accidentally. So make sure not to teach as a student, so you don't end up, he doesn't end up in exile, you will also end up in exile. Kumtois. But what do we see here? What kind of a student we're talking about? We're not talking about a perfect student. As the fall from Talmud Shagolo. But what kind of student is the Gemara talking about? A student who ends up in exile. Retzich Gorbi Iker is actually talking mainly wegen Talmud She'enei Hogun. We're talking about a student who's not fitting. That's why the Gemara says to be careful not to teach a Talmud She'enei Hogun. The Gemara assumes that the students that ends up in exile because he killed somebody accidentally was not a fitting student to begin with. So here, the Gemara says that even by not such a fitting student, you end up in exile. What is the rationale? The Rambam says The rationale is because his life is not a life without Torah. We're talking about somebody who's not proper, mainly, and not a proper student. Is wie nennt man rein azat Talmid? So how can we include such a student in them sug from Balei Chochma Mevakesho, that he's in the category of the masters of wisdom and seeking wisdom? This unfitting student, bis zu sagen, to the extent that we say, we rationalize it as ein Chayim b'loi Talmud Torah k'misach hashuva, that his life without Torah is considered like Misa, and that's why we're Maglin, but we're talking about not proper student who ends up in Golus. So why would we say about such a student, the Rambam, that his life isn't a life without Torah? And the Rebbe explains now in the bracket that one can argue maybe that the fact that he's not proper does not refer to his Torah. We'll split, we'll compartmentalize. We'll say, yes, he's a Talmud she'enei Hogan, meaning his conduct as far as mitzvahs in his actions, he's not proper, he doesn't do things right. However, Torah, he is fully engaged in Torah. The Rebbe says that we see practically one who's not Hagun, he's not careful in his Maisa, that impacts also his dedication to his learning as well. So that can't distinguish and say that there's a difference between he's not proper in mitzvahs, but he's still Torah at the highest level. Without Torah, he's will consider his dead, that is his life. You can't say that because if he's not proper, he wouldn't be. He's not doing proper Torah either. So why are we saying that he must send his teacher? Because his life is not life without Torah. Main bepashtus. Even though on a simple level, what are we talking about? Not fitting and not b'maiso. He's not fitting. He's not proper in his action. That his conduct is not proper. Aber b'negeya zayin limud, but as it reflects, as it's connected to his study, ken efsher zayin as in them is kidboy. Maybe that's properly so proper. So you don't have evidence that the Gemara is talking about a student who's not really into learning. All what we're saying is that his actions are not proper, but maybe in learning he can be on the highest level. Zet ben aber bemuchash, but we see practically as b'shas as felt in that anhoga from Talmud, that when there is lacking in the conduct of a Talmud in his action, in his meiser, feltes oiches and asmode ushkide b'limude, then it would also be lacking in his diligence and his devotion, his studiousness in his study. Unavadai kemen nitzogen by azat talmid aklal, and for sure by such a student you can't give the uh, rule, the statement, biz as the far magel in the rabbi, and because of this statement you can't say about him that statement, and that's why you'd even take the rabbi as ein Talmud Torah is geworden sein Leben Chaim, that his Torah became his life. If his conduct isn't proper, we can't say that his Torah is his life. Damit muss es haben wirken auf seine Anhoge. Had the Torah been his life, then it must have impacted his conduct. So why does the Rambam say that that's the reason? Is because his life would not be a life. We're not talking about such a student. The halach is by everybody. So how do we explain the Rambam? So while the Rambam tries to rationalize the reason for sending thereof, but doesn't seem like he's talking about the ordinary student, which the halacha is that you send the Rav to be in exile with the student by all kinds of students. And mostly we're talking about Einei Hagam mainly. So how could the Rambam rationalize that the reason would be because he, without Torah, his life is not alive? And Ois Gimel, the Rebbe says that the Ragachover actually says that this is not the real reason. He says this is a spiritual reason. The Rambam, the Ragachover gives the reason. He says it's the rabbi's own fault because the Rav taught somebody not proper, so he should go in Golus because he failed, so he goes to Golus, but not the reason of the Rambam. That's the Ragachover. The Rebbe doesn't buy into that because the Rebbe says in Halacha and the Rambam has a few reasons, challenges a little bit the rationale of the Ragachover, but he also points that Rambam's is Halacha. We have to find a way to explain what the Rambam is saying, that his life is not a life, even by the ordinary student, not just to say this is a spiritual reason. It has to fit with halach. As Rebbe will explain, Gimel. Benegeya der Heisofa v'tam from the Rambam, as it relates to the addition, the reason of the Rambam, v'chaye bali chochma hulu, that the life of the masters of the wisdom, etc., schreibt der Ragachover in Atshuva. The Ragachover writes in a response, "V'zehu tam ruchni." This is a spiritual reason. Und sagt dort an ander tam, beposhet, he says another reason, simple. Von den von Magdalene Rabbi Ime for the halacha exiling the teacher with the student. Der fun gufa, because the fact alone, this is something that the teacher did wrong, that he was teaching such a student that ended up killing somebody. So from the fact itself was their Talmud, this student is a heilig nefesh bishgogo, is killing somebody accidentally, is a raya, that is a proof as it is a Talmud she'eino hogan, that he's not a proper student, because otherwise he wouldn't kill somebody accidentally. Since we're not supposed to, you're not allowed to teach a student who is not proper, as the Gemara says. Kumtois as who, that turns out that he, quoting the Ragachover, Rabbi Posha Bazeh, that he was negligent. L'cheinu meshubet. That's why he's enslaved, and that's why he has to go along with him. So the Ragachover says this is not the reason of the Rambam, but this is a simple reason because the rabbi is negligent. The rabbi said, hey, that is only if the Rav knew about it. He knew, he reckoned maybe the Rav didn't see it, so why would he go to exile? Allah doesn't distinguish with them. But besides, the Rebbe says we have to understand the Rambam's reasoning. It's not the Ruchni. Aber Neusef of them Tzarichin and them Tam from Ragachover. In addition to what needs to be looked into in the Ragachover's reasoning, was Lipirushe Kumtuis, according to his interpretation, it turns out he says that the reason is because the Rav did something wrong by teaching this Talmud Shenayin Hogan as the din from Talmud Shegolo Maglin Rabbi Imoi, that according to his reasoning, this halacha of a Talmud that goes to exile, we will exile the teacher with him, is Dafki Nafal, would only be in a case when Euch der Rab is Nitkin Hogan. That would only be a case where the Rav is not doing proper because he was teaching das heißt, as a other kent as Talmide is Nitkin Hogan. He knew, he recognized that his student wasn't proper and he continued teaching him. Unot afal pikein pesheya given, and yet, and still, knowing that the student was not Hogan, he was still negligent. Und gelernt mit him hepech hadin, he learned with him going against the halacha. And only that, but what happens if the Rav didn't know? Then it wouldn't apply the din. There's no such a distinction. So the Ragachova's reasoning doesn't really hold up in other cases. There's other issues that the Rebbe has with the interpretation of the Ragachover. The Rebbe says not going into is Oidvikir, but the main thing, in addition, and the main thing issue the Rebbe has, we have to try to understand the halacha of the Rambam. We can't just say it's a spiritual reasoning. The fun gufa was the Rambam bring them tam besifrei Mishneh Torah. The fact that the Rambam brings the reasoning in the halacha sefer Mishneh Torah, was is a sefer from halachas, which is a sefer which gives laws and laws, is mukhrach zu sagen, we have to say, as loit shitas Rambam, according to the Rambam's view, is oder tam, the reasoning that we say. Notwithstanding, afila there is a tam ruchni, even though it's a spiritual reason, because the life and everything is it over is gehalten neuchal derech halacha. It's something which also passes the test of halacha, that it needs to be halachically sound. Upshita, and it's obvious as there is need bestiret to the halacha psuka, and it's obvious that this reasoning cannot be contradicted in a very clear ruling. As yeder Talmud shegolu is maglin Rabbi Imai. Every student that went into exile, the master, the teacher will go with him, and he will, go with him. But according to the reasoning, only if the life of the student is he goes with him according to the Rambam's reasoning. So how do we explain here what the Rambam says? The Rebbe now is going to go into a whole explanation what the Rambam means when he says those masters of Chokhmah and those who seek Chokhmah. If we should say that in addition to mastering Chokhmah, he also goes to level of seeking Chokhmah. So besides, it makes it very difficult again. So only those people, not only are they Balei Chokhmah, but they have to seek Chokhmah, whose life is not life. The Rebbe therefore concludes that the Rambam is saying two things. Either he is actually a master of Chokhmah already, or he's just seeking Chokhmah. The Rebbe will bring out that just by seeking Chokhmah, the person already's life is not a life, even though he's not a Chacham yet. And that explains that any student is considered to be Mevak Sheho, at least he seeks Chokhmah, as the Rebbe will explain. He's Daled. So we can say the explanation Behagdim Diuk Loshna Rambam by first introducing the specific language that the Rambam uses over here. He says, Bali Chochma Umevaksheho B'loi Talmud Torah Chulu. That the masters of wisdom and those who seek it, if there is no Torah, it's considered like Misa, like death. B'lechayre, would seem in Pasuk steht doch B'loi Chochma Techaye Ba'aleho. The pasuk only talks about the masters. The Chokmah gives life to the Bailim. Doesn't say those who seek. And the Rambam is Meisif, Umevaksha. The Rambam asks, and those that seek it. In addition to being masters of Chokmah, they also seek it. And when you say they also seek it, it's not just a different change of language. This changes this whole idea. Befrat, Ados is a Haysof and Nitnor Belosha. This is not just adding language here, nor in Teuchen and contents. Bali Chochma is their pshat. Masters of Chochma means the meaning of it as a learn Torah in an oifon as Terosi Lehu, that he's learning Torah in such a way that it becomes his. He becomes the master of the wisdom. Ervert Bailim of the Divrei Torah Shalomad. He becomes the owners on the words of Torah that he learned, which means Nikra Sal Shemoy. This is his Torah. It's called on his name. Und the Gemara sagt, and when does a person reach this level that the Torah is called on his name? Das ist dafke, wenn man lernt in an Eufum von Yehege. V'seroso Yehege, when he learns in a way of Yehege, li'iyuna, intensely, in a way of Iyun, then he becomes masters of Torah. And now we're adding and saying umevaksheho. So another on top of that, on top of being a master of Torah learning, in Be'iyun, he keeps on seeking learning more Torah. Is Moisif as er is nicht mistapik. He's not satisfied with the divrei Torah was hat schon gelernt, with the words of Torah that he already studied. Keine Gewinn that he owns. Na er is mevakshah. Sucht ständig noch. Looking always for more. So steigen hecher in Asagas HaTorah to grow even higher, continues the higher in grasping Torah. And there's no end to it. You can always mevakshah, because even if you're a master of Torah, you can still want to hear he's seeking Torah. Warum zu Asagas HaTorah is king gewolnit, there's no limit to grasping Torah. As the Pasuk says, Torah is longer than any measure of land, and it's wider than the ocean. Harambam, to use the Lashon of the Rambam, this would describe Mevaksheho, the one who seeks it, is Ha'eved Ma'ave Eisek B'Torah, one who serves Hashem out of love, occupies in Torah, V'hoilech B'nesivis HaChochma, he goes in the passageways of wisdom. Nafshik Shura Ba'avas Hashem. His soul is tied in this love to Hashem. V'nimtzo Shoiga Ba'atomit. And it turns out that he's continuously learning in the Torah. Kumt ois. So here the Rambam says that not only is he a master of Torah, but is also Mevaksheho. So it turns out that when will be Magle Rabbi Ima if he has the two advantages. Kommt to is as Leuten Rambam, wenn passt zu sagen, as Talmud Torah Chochma ist geworden, the ganze Chaim shel Adam. When is it fitting to say that the learning of Torah, which is Chochma, that became his life, his full life, when that is nit nor Bali Chochma. Not only he is master of Chochma, not only does he learn it intently, nor the Rambam adds to it that also that he has to be seeking Torah. Isn't it moving canal? We don't understand. I said before. Was is der Mokara Rambam of the Resofa welcher steht nicht im Posik? What is Rambam's source of this edition, which does not record it in the Posik? The Posik says, Chochma Techaye Baleo. It doesn't say Chochma Mevaksheho Techaye Baleo. Nochmer. And furthermore, the issue becomes, it turns out that the student is on a very, not only about Chochma, he's also Mevakesh Chochma. But anybody who's not on that level, we're not going to send the Rav into Golus, the teacher, together with the student. That's not the halacha. Noch mehr, al pizeh, wird noch starker the Shailan al Sivbeis. This even makes the question of earlier Sivbeis even more harder to understand. As the Tamar Rambam is l'chayr nit masim mit der halacha bepoil. That the Rambam's reason does not fit the halacha bepoil, that we will send to exile by even people, Arav, even by a student who's not at this level of Baal Chochm Umevaksha. Api Hanal, but based on the above, what the Rambam writes, Kommt us as Kidei zu Mechayev sein Rabbi zu gehen in Golus zu Lib Talmido, in order to obligate the teacher to go into exile because of his student, muss der Talmud haben, then the Talmud must have nicht nur the Meile von Bali Chochma, not just being master of Chochma, nor the Tchuna from Mevak Sheho. He also needs to have the characteristic of seeking Torah. But that's not what the Gemara says. B'shas says in Gemara state in as der Fall from Talmud Shegolo that the Gemara says that the case in which a student that goes into exile is beikir by a Talmud Sheinogen. It's mainly by a Talmud who's not proper. And here we're saying on the highest level. And the Rebbe now, so the Rebbe is asking, why? Where does the Rambam take this from and makes it even on a higher level, this student? And in the Gemara, we actually look at this student as a non-proper student, as the Rebbe brought out earlier. And therefore, the Rebbe is going to answer now that Umevaksha is not on top of Bali Chochmah, but rather an option. Either he is already Bal Chochmah, or at least he seeks it, which would mostly qualify for old Talmuds. Hey, that's why it appears to me to say, the Rebbe explains, As kavonos harambam mider hisopim mevaksho. What does the Rambam mean when he adds the words and those who seek Torah? Is nicht zu moisiv sein a zweiten Tnai. It's not to add a second condition in Dargas HaTalmud. On the level, the step where the Talmud is standing. Nor der Vav von umevakesheho, the Vav and those who seek it, is b'mekom tevas oi, is in the place of the word or. Ki ilu evol gishrim, as if the Rambam writing, Balei Chochma oy mevaksheho. Either they're already Balei Chochma or they're seeking it. Let's haste. Means. The Rambam read wegen zwei Sugen, the Rambam discusses two categories. Aleph, die welche seine schön in der Darge von Balei Chochma, those who already reached the level of Balei Chochma. Ba'al kol ponim mevaksheho, but base, number two, at least they're seeking it. They seien noch nicht geworden Balei Chochma. They have not yet become Balei Chochma. Aber sie suchen zu werden Balei Chochma, but they're searching to become Balei Chochma. Und wie bald das Teure is maftiach, since Teure promises, Yogaito matzoso tamin, if you put in effort and you will find belief, is borur, so then it's very clear, a soif that in the end, better verna Bal Chochma, even if he is not, but he's seeking it, he will become a Bal Chochma. So it turns out, as bekoyach izer shen itzta Bal Chochma, that potentially he's already Bal Chochma. Was chayev b'lei Talmud Torah ki misach hashuvim. His life without Talmud Torah is misach hashuvim, because he has the potential of a Talmud Chacham, even though he's not a Bal Chacham yet. So based on this explanation, we have the answer. Was der Din wird gesagt b'shayches zu jedem Talmud? Why this halacha is said in connection to every student. Even if the Talmud is not fitting. Warum der Fun Gufa was the Rav. The fact alone that the Rav was is doch bestama Rav Hogun, the assumption is that he is a proper Rav. So why did he take in such a student when you're not supposed to? If he was in a Hogun, he wasn't supposed to take him. So why did he take him in as a student? Is Araya, that's evident that the Rav had der Zen, that the Rav realized saw a kaponim gefilt, or at least he felt in them Talmud that this student Azed is in Gedder that he's at least in the defined the one who seeks it. As there zucht a kolponim, that at least he's searching to Bal Chochma, to want to become a master of Chochma. Weil anders wollte nicht angenommen als Talmud, because otherwise he would not have accepted him as a student. The fact that he takes this Talmud who is maybe ain't a Hogan, it means that he thinks of him that he can turn him around, that he at least is Vaksho. Und der Fall is der Din as Maglin Rabbi, and that's why the halacha is that we will exile the teacher with him, in order to bring out by this student this idea from potential to actuality, that this mevaksho, that he becomes a Bal Chochma. Und soll werden a Baal Chochma bepoil, for him to become a master wisdom in actuality. Durch machen von dem Talmud she'ene Hogun a Talmud Hogun, by making from this non-fitting student into a fitting student, a proper student. Bier soll werden bis soll werden a Baal Chochma, until he will become a Baal Chochma. So this is the explanation that Mevakshel, the Rambam writes, is that you don't have to be a Baal Chochma, but at least you're seeking the Chochma. And that's where the Rav took you. And that's why, even though you're not Hogan, we have to give it to you because potentially you have that potential, and that makes a difference of life and death by you. And the Rebbe explains now furthermore that this whole idea is not just the day you come into exile, it's for the duration of exile. And the Rav will, during that period, turn your tak around to become a Baal Chochma. Der din von Ovid le'midi tahave lechiyusa, this din that do for him something that he has his life, does not apply only in the beginning. Is nit nor benegei the mershten rega. It's not only about the first instant when der heilig nefesh b'shkoga kommt in golus, when the one who killed somebody accidentally comes to golus. We have to make sure at that point. Nor der v'chai muss bavonen werden, but we need to make sure that he lives of dem ganzen Zman, the entire time was gefindt sich dorten, that he is in exile, which is at Moisa Kohen HaGodel. He has to stay in exile until the high priest, the Kohen Godel, until he dies. So we have to make sure that v'chai. V'al pizer kumtois, so therefore it turns out, as der chiyuv from Maglin Rabbi Imoy, that when we bring this teacher into exile with him is not just for that instant. It's not just because of the present condition of the Talmud. In which Chochma is his life only potentially. But also because of the condition in which the Talmud will achieve and will be later on. Then he's actually going to be a master of Chochma. So we have to provide for him for his duration while he's there. And maybe now he's just potentially, but he's going to become a Baal Chochma as it goes on. So therefore, we have to provide for him for that time as well. Since already now he is defined as one who seeks Torah, is the borur, so then it's very clear. In the end, he will become a master of Chochma, bepoil in actuality. Kinal, as we said before. V'yesh loymar, there is we can say as er hat sich schon angehoben össig sein in dem bepoil, that he already started to occupy himself actually in seeking mevakish to become a Baal Chochma, and the Riber shen itzter the chiyuv to avonen the mevachai from Talmud, and therefore already now there is the obligation to make sure that the vachai from the Talmud. So he may be sheine hogun, but since he started mevaksheho and he's going in that direction, and he already started to do this. So therefore, and that's why the rabbi probably took him in as a student. And that's why this becomes his life. And that's why the Rambam says this as a reason for any student. If he's a student, he has this potential and this striving and will eventually reach to become the Baal Chochma. So what do we see from this? So from this we see that one who wants to, even if presently he is not, but connecting with the Rav will help him turn himself around to become a Baal Chochma. And this is the Rebbe's initiative that the Rebbe spoke about everybody to Asay L'chor Rav. And so the Rebbe connects this that we see how much a Rav can accomplish. Vov. Eine von the Gor einfache Heroes. One of the very simple lessons from the Inyan Hanalis, from the above idea, is the Goydel HaInyan for Asel Charav, the great matter, the important matter of making for you a Rav. When you make a true accounting on your own, and you realize, oh, that you're in a condition that you're not a proper student. Ken men reinfallen in you, one may descend, fall into hopelessness, giving up, God forbid. Wie wird man kennen herauskommen von der Matze? How can I get out of this condition? Und sich übermachen, and to turn myself around, make myself over in a Talmud Hokum to become a proper Talmud. Und wer hat noch zu werden aber Chochma, not just a proper Talmud, but to become a master of Chochma. So even though presently he's in a Hogun as the Talmud, but then he's going to become a Baal Chochma, we're saying. If them is the Eitzah, here is the advice, Aseh l'chorav, make for yourself a Rav. When gefinta Rav amiti, when you find a true Rav, is borur as the Rav et mitim knelm. So then it's certain that the Rav will work hard with him, knelm. If to machen von ihm Talmud Hogan, to make into him, turn him into a fitting student. No matter how his present condition is, if he is defined, he seeks it, he's mevaksheho, he seeks the wisdom, he seeks Torah. He's looking to become a Talmud Hokum. Is a fila der Weile is noch in a matzav yorut kozeh. So even that in the meantime he's still on such a low level, was fodert mitzad dem Rav, that requires the Rav a yerida v'hashpola. The Rav needs to descend and lower himself. Bedugma tzuminyan hagolus, similar to Golus, to go into exile. So the Rav, in order to come down to this student's level, needs to descend to him. Paskun Torah, the Torah rules, as Talmud Shagolo Maglin Rabbi Imai, that a student who has been exiled, who's in that level, the teacher goes into Golus with him, and therefore, Noisef as the Rav vet mitim lernen, in addition that the Rav will teach him, will study with him, that there is a reinlegen. He's going to invest and put himself in to make him into a good student, a proper student. This to the Dargi from Baal Chochma, up till to make him into the level that he'll become a master of wisdom. Bis zu werden kemoise der Rav Mamish, so that he's Maglin, Rabbi Imai, that he becomes kemoise like the Rav himself. So this is the lesson, what the Rav can accomplish to make from a Talmud she'enei Hogun, not only into a Hogun, but the Rav descends and work with him, not only Torah, but also to take him out from his Eina Hogun situation, to make him to Hogun, to make him a master of Chochmah until he becomes like the Rav. And the Rebbe is going to explain now also in the Avodah, a spiritual level and the service of each one. Zayin, that inyan von Talmud Shegola Magna Rabbi Imei Zech Faran in the Avodah Ruchni Shekol Echad Ve'echad, that also exists in the spiritual service of each and every one. By oneself. Jeder Id is mit Neibersten Bedugma Kaveyochel Ve'atalmud Rabbi. And this is every Yid relationship with Hashem is similar to a student with his teacher. With the Pasuk says, "V'chol banayich," and all of your children, which is chol banayich, yadarid, that includes everybody. is Lemudei Hashem are students of Hashem. Lemudei means Talmidei Hashem are the students of Hashem. Every Yid is a student of Hashem. So there's a relationship between a Yid and the Eibishter as a student with a Rab. Jeder Yid is a Talmud von Eibishter, every Yid is a student of Hashem. Und b'shas a Yid tut chas v'sholom achet neged Hashem, when a Yid, God forbid, commits a sin against Hashem, is a doch lefisho. So then, temporarily, biz v'shover ofelo, till he can return and he will be healed, a Talmud Sheina Hogan, then he is a student who is not profiting. So when a Yid can sometimes become next to Hashem, who is master improper, und the Sibbe v'efshorius, if a hate is. So why is there a reason? Why can a person commit a sin? Was is need came bal chokma that he is not a master of wisdom. Chokma is godliness. The in Hashem b'chokma, and therefore, if the person allows for his chokma of his nefesh to function by him, he wouldn't sin. The whole idea the person sins is because he covers up. As the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, Vabir. Alter Rebbe is provided in Tanya and Posuk Hanal. The Alter Rebbe explains this Posuk, HaChochma Techayeh Baleho, as der Chayes Funayid, says the Alter Rebbe, as the Chayes Funayid kommt von Ebersten. Ein so Baruch Hu. The vitality of a Yid comes from the infinite, blessed be from Hashem, his miyachis, sein Chayes, and we relate the person's vitality to Chokhmah. Chokhmah, which is Ein Sof, is the life. We say the Chokhmah Techayah. So why do we say the Chokhmah? But it's Hashem. But Hashem, HaChokhmah Techayah. Well, Ein Sof Baruch Hu, that explains the Alter Rebbe, is Melubish, Bebchinas Chokhmah Shebenefesh HaOdom, but no matter what Yid there is, the Ein Sof is dressed up in his Chokhmah. Und der Chayes von Ebersten is mispashet, and then the vitality from the Eberster expands b'chol b'chinas hanefesh kulo in all of the levels of the nefesh. Lach yosu to violet dur b'chinas ha-chokhmah. Through the level of Chokhmah. Chokhmah is the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof is that expands into all the other powers of the nefesh, the power of the Ein Sof. Befar b'shas means in gather from Bali Chokhmah. If you are at the level, you're defined as masters of Chokhmah. Fühlt man dem Verbund, was man hat mit Neubersten, then you feel that connection you have with Hashem. Mit Ein Sof Baruch Hu, with the infinite, was is meluvish b'bechinas ha-chokhmah shebenefesh, which is dressed in the level of Chokhmah, the nefesh, you feel it, the connection with Hashem. B'meila is man shaykh zu keninyan von chet, and therefore you have no connection to any aspect, matter of sin. The afshoris of chet nemtzer derfun, how is the possibility of sin comes from the fact, was miznit kein bal chokhmah, you're not the master of chokhmah, the chokhmah is not revealed by you. Man fühlt nicht den Verbund mit Rabbi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you don't feel that tied to your master, to Hashem. When you sin against Hashem, that's how you come to a sin, because you don't have the level of Chokhmah, and you sin to Hashem. Go sin, commit a sin against Hashem. Then you have dealings with the Redeemer of blood, which is the Yetzer Hara. Because the Yetzer Hara, who convinces you to do the Aveda, later on criticizes you and wants to take revenge of you. That is this Satan, the same Yetzer Hara, and there's Malchamavis. Was will bringen Aiden zu Amatze for Misaruchnis Rachman Litzlan. He wishes to bring a Yid to a condition, spiritual death, God forbid. If them is the halacha berurah in Torah, so then the Torah tells us very clearly, Talmid Shagolam. So the student failed, and he is in exile. Magalin Rabbi Imei, the master, Hashem goes with him, was Beruchnis Metis. Och der Id is bepoil ubegolin nit kimbal chokhmah. Even though the Yid in actuality open is not about chokhmah, that's why he committed this in the first place. Is chas v'shalom zu sagen. God forbid to say, as the Faris by him this battle geworden der Verbund mit Nebersten, to say that's why the connection to Hashem has been negated. There's no more connection there. God forbid, we can't say that. It's not about chokhmah right now. Because every year, no matter who is a koponim and gather from the vaksheho, at least he seeks it. With the bavuster word for Rabbi Seinu as the known expression of our teachers, our leaders, as Aid, niter vilu, niter ken sein, obgerissen von Göttlichkeit, neither a yid, neither wants to and not is able to be torn away from godliness. So we are all really mevaksha. We're not really torn away. The sin does not take us away. We may not be bal chochma because we didn't listen, we didn't realize, and we failed, but we're still mevaksha. B'meilis beim ständig voran die Iskashos mit Neubersten by Yid, there is always that connection to Hashem. As is nor, what happens was der Verbund is by him behalten, that tie is hidden. Tanya, to use the language of the Tanya, it's in a level of asleep by the Rishoyim. So they have it, they have the Chokhmah, but it's asleep. Aber euch demult is as Megan from Goyal Adam. But then also, even while it's asleep, and that still protects the Goyal Adam, und der Los nit kemisse Ruchnis Rachman al-Islam, that does not allow for him to totally kill him. The Goyal Adam can't touch him in the city of refuge. It can't touch him. And it protects him from the spiritual death. And when a Yid shows his yearning, so that he wants to become a proper student, openly, that is gleich poil sein pulosei, so this immediately will impact what the action of Tzumachim von him, a Talmud Hogun Abal Chochma, to turn him in, make of him a proper student and a master of Chochma. Was Damot HaChochma Techaya. Then the Chochma will give him a life, the Chochma will begin to function again. Das bringt in ihm a rein Achayis von Kedusha v'chol koiches nafshe. This brings into him a energy, a vitality of Kedusha in all of the powers of his soul. But that automatically negates the dominance of the Yetzer Hara. So on the spiritual sense, the Rebbe explains the sin of a person comes because he's not a Baal Chochma. He's not a Talmud, becomes not a Talmud Hogun. And because of that, when he fails, he has to deal with the Goyal Hadam, who's the Satan Yetzer Hara, wants to totally spiritually kill him. But we're all remained always, the Rabbi is Imay, the Eberster is always with a Yid, that even though that he failed, the Eberster will still is connected with him. He remains a Mevaksheho because the Yid always wants to remain connected with the Eberster. And then that protects him, the Eberster protects him, not to completely fail. And then when you show a yearning, you live up and then you change yourself around and you actually become the Chokhmah Techaya, you get back openly that level of Chokhmah that you have. So this is about an individual Yid. The Rebbe says now this is also about the condition that we're now in exile. We also have a similar situation. Yes. Just as it pertains to every individual, similar, and it's actually a forerunner, of course, is as Benegeya Klal Yisrael, as it is the Yidden in general, about staying connected, and Maglin Rabbi, the Eibishter, is with us and is going to protect us. Pshas Yidden gefinnen sich in Golus, when Yidden find himself in exile, befrat Golus ha'achren, especially in this later Golus. Proti is, and in very specific of the specific in the Mchoshev, Kofel, Mechupel, for Nikvasa the Mashiach in this double and quadrupled darkness of the hills of Mashiach. Keman reinfallen chas v'sholem in you may fall into a situation, God forbids, of hopelessness. Ma'ayin Yovi Ezri. Where am I going to get my help? Zok Teira. Teira says, halacha berura. A very clear halacha. That Talmid Shagola Maglin Rabbi Imei. That a student who has gone to exile, the Rav, the Eibishter is with you. So this is a halacha that the Eibishter said that when the student goes, the teacher goes with him, and the Eibishter tells his halachas to the Yidden. He does it also. Mashu Eisu Emer Yisrael is what he does himself. He tells the Yidden to do. Is B'meila move on the difference understood that the Eibishter Rabbi, that the Eibishter who's the teacher, the master, Gefinzich Kavayochel, finds himself, so to speak, in Golus zusammen mit Yidden, is an exile together with the Yid, Talmidei. Ukamayim Chazal, as the sages of blessed memory say, Yisrael. All places, wherever Yidden exile, our sages tell us Shechinei Mom, the divine is with them. Und Kutchabrichu ishtaken beinayu begalusa, and the Eibishter finds himself amongst them in exile. The Kori va'omar, and he calls out and he says, Shuvu bonim, return my sons, my children. Erpe meshuva seichem, I will heal you when you return. Erpoilt, he impacts, he heals them. That we should become proper students. Und durch them geht man heraus von Golus, and that way we go out of Golus. So the Eibishter is here taking us out. Noch mehr. Chazal seine Medaik. The Rebbe says the specific Lashon, you don't just bring the Rav to Golus, you exile the Rav, which means he lowers him to the level. Seine Medaik maglin Rabbi Imei, nicht mevin Rabbi Imei. It doesn't say you bring. You exile Kietzmei, was thus meant. Not just bring or some other language, but thus meant as beim Rav is thus a matzav shel golus. That also by the Rav it becomes a situation, by the Rav, a situation of golus. Nicht nur as der Rav darf sich gefinden in derselbe Stadt mit seinem Talmud. It's not just that the Rav needs to find himself in the same city where his student, but in the city itself, he walks around free. If that was the case, the Rav will not be able to influence. In such a situation, the Rav goes around free, doesn't feel that exile, he won't fully be able to influence from Talmud and an Eifen in a way from Ovid le Midit Havid le Chayusa, in a way that it should be his vitality. Because he's walking around free, is too far of a distance between the Rav and the teacher. It's a tremendous distance, and there's a disconnect, there's an interruption. The Talmud is in Golus, the Talmud, they're in the same place, but the student is in exile, and the Rav in Cheres, the Rav is in freedom. Ubemele is this meglich, and therefore, how is it possible as the Rav that the Rav should be able to fully invest himself, put himself into in them Talmid's matzav, the condition of the students, to turn him into a master of wisdom. If there's a disconnect, the Rabbi must go into exile. The Rav darf sich gefunden in demselben matzav. He needs to find himself in the same condition, Golus, with the Talmud gefindt sich as the Talmud finds himself. So this is in the Gemara. So the similar ways with the Eibishter over here. Similarly, as it relates, so to speak, the Eibishter mit Yidden, to Hashem with Yidden. When Yidden seien in Golus, when Yidden are in exile, is noise of Voeschanan mohem is Shechinah begalus in addition that the Shechinah is with them, meaning that Shechinah is in exile. The Shechinah is in Golus. The Shechinah is all in exile. Mishnam b'chol tzorosum loitzor. So he is in Golus. Shechinah begalus is not the Shechinah is there. in all their difficulties, Lloyd saw the Eibishter has the same difficulty. See, Zayin Tzorah Kaviyachol, it's Hashem's problem, so to speak. Hashchina Shruya in Yisrael B'Tzoras Goluson. The Shechina rests with the Yidden in the troubles of their exile. Ubemele is Nitoki in Ortvar Yush Chas v'Shalom. So therefore, there is no room for helplessness. God forbid. V'adrabah. On the contrary, it says Boru. It's very clear. As nit kuchen dikon von Matzav Oyem v'Neira from Golus. That not, despite this awesome and terrible situation of Golus, of exile, is Abaye Shemrecha, Abaye Tzilcha. Hashem protects you as your shadow. He is on your right hand side. So, with all the difficulties, is to know that He is Al Yad Yimenecha. V'oid v'ikar. In addition, and mainly, V'bal da Shchinta begalusam. Since the Shechina is in Golus, is Afila Oiv Mitzad the Matzah from Eden. Even, let's say, the condition of a Yid. There would be a thought as their Golus Daf Chaz v'Sholom noch a bissel doiren that the Golus needs to last a little longer. God forbid, is lemani eser for my sake, because the Eibishter is in Golus. So the Rebbe says for my own sake, as the pasuk in Yeshaya says, the Eibishter brings the Geula zu lib sich kavyochel. The Eibishter brings the Geula for himself, so to speak. When you're in a way of very hastily, quickly, without delaying them even as the blink of an eye. The Rebbe takes himself and his children out from Golus, the exile, and leads them, and they go together, zusammen, in der Geula, Hamitis Vashlemo, Miyad Mamash, in the true and complete redemption, and immediately Mamash. This is Sichos Chof Tevis, which is Hilula the Rambam. The Rebbe says in the note over here of Likutei Sichos, in which the Rebbe discusses that this is actually the Hilula, there's Chavdalet, there's other opinions over there, other views, but the Rebbe over there references that and figures out that the Rambam's Yortzeit is on Chav Tevis, and this is in the year Tavshin Memhei.